Welcome to Sleepy Crime. Wherever you are right now, maybe lying in bed, curled under a blanket, or listening with headphones in a quiet room, I hope you're ready to wind down. Let the day fade away. Let your shoulders relax. Breathe a little slower. There's nothing to do right now except listen. Tonight, I want to tell you a story. It's dark and disturbing and difficult at times, but you don't need to hold onto every detail. You can let your mind drift in and out like waves coming to shore. I'll be here, guiding you through it, calmly and gently. You're safe. This one takes place in California, but not the California you see in postcards. Not the beaches, not the movie sets, not the surfboards and smiling tourists. This is the California of the late 1970s. A place of restless highways and flickering gas stations. Of teenagers walking alone on suburban streets where the sun set behind telephone poles and the world felt a little too quiet. There were warnings back then, whispers, really. Girls were disappearing. One here, one there. No one saw what happened. They were just gone. Police didn't have much to go on. No clear suspect. No pattern. But fear has a way of growing in the silence. Parents started locking doors earlier. Teenagers stopped hitchhiking. And still, the van kept driving. A plain gray van. Just another vehicle on the road. Inside were two men. Strangers to the girls they followed. Strangers to most of the world. But to each other, they were something else. They had met in prison. Talked in code. Swapped stories. And what they planned together was far worse than anyone could have imagined. They called themselves the Toolbox Killers, and for 5 months in 1979, they turned a van into a place of terror, a mobile trap filled with hardware tools and cruelty beyond belief. But before that, they were just two men, sitting side by side, planning what would come next. And that's where we begin. Lawrence Sigmund Bittaker was born in 1940 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He wasn't abused as a child. He wasn't raised in chaos or squalor. In fact, he was adopted by well-meaning parents, moved frequently because of his father's job in the aviation industry, and showed signs of intelligence early on. His IQ would later be measured at 138, well above average. But intelligence didn't stop the trouble. Bittaker began stealing at a young age. By his late teens, he had already been arrested multiple times for theft, for auto-related offenses, and eventually for assault. He didn't like authority. He didn't like being told what to do. And behind his calm demeanor, there was something cold. Something that didn't quite connect to the pain of others. He drifted through jobs, cities, and prisons. Every time he was released, he'd reoffend within months. But he didn't leave much of a mark. No headlines. No deep investigations. Just another repeat offender with a record and no direction. Roy Lewis Norris was born in 1948 in Colorado. Unlike Bittaker, his upbringing was a mess. He was born into chaos. His parents fought constantly, and he later claimed to have suffered abuse, neglect, and humiliation. As a teenager, Norris developed disturbing thoughts. Violent ones. He would later admit that he had fantasies of assaulting women even in high school. At 17, he joined the Navy, but military life didn't straighten him out. In fact, while stationed in San Diego, he attempted to assault a woman. It wouldn't be his last attempt. Over the next few years, Norris was in and out of mental institutions and prisons. Psychologists noted his disturbing sexual obsessions, his impulsive behavior, and his complete lack of remorse. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia at one point, though opinions would vary. Still, no matter what labels were attached to him, the pattern was clear. Norris had no control over his desires and no desire to control them. In 1977, both men were incarcerated at the California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo. That prison wasn't just for hardened criminals. It had a reputation as being relatively relaxed, especially among inmates who wanted to avoid gang violence and hard labor. It was there, among a mix of white-collar offenders and quiet manipulators, that Bittaker and Norris met. At first glance, they didn't seem like a pair. Bittaker was older, more reserved, almost studious. Norris was younger, twitchier, more emotional. But they shared something. A darkness. A sense of not belonging among normal men. They found themselves talking often during meals, in the yard, in passing. What started as casual conversation grew more specific, more intense, more detailed. Eventually, their talks turned toward fantasies. Not just violent ones, but calculated ones. How to abduct a girl. How to keep her quiet. How long they could make it last. The prison walls around them didn't dampen their ideas. If anything, they gave the men a safe space to explore them. Together, they began building a plan not just for one act of violence, but for a series. They wouldn't kill for money. Not for jealousy or revenge. Their motive was simpler and more disturbing. They wanted to hurt young women. Teenagers. For fun. For control. For something they couldn't quite put into words, but felt drawn to like a magnet. They made a pact. Once they were released, they'd find each other on the outside. Buy a van. Equip it with tools. And begin hunting. Bittaker would be the driver. Clean cut. The type who could charm someone into a sense of safety. Norris would be the enforcer. Stronger. Faster. Willing to grab, to restrain, to silence. The prison guards didn't notice anything unusual. No one flagged their friendship. No one saw a threat. Just two men waiting out their sentences, talking about life. In October of 1978, Lawrence Bittaker was released. He moved to Los Angeles and quickly found work as a machinist. His employers described him as reliable, polite, even friendly. He didn't drink, didn't use drugs. He read books on science and watched television alone in his apartment. No one suspected a thing. 5 months later, in January 1979, Roy Norris walked out of prison too. And almost immediately, he contacted Bittaker. The plan was still on. They just needed one thing, a van. The plan had been set months earlier, spoken in whispers behind concrete walls. But now, on the outside, it took shape in metal and motion. The first thing they needed was a vehicle. Not just any car. Not a flashy convertible or a beat-up junker that would draw attention. They needed something large, quiet, plain, something with sliding doors and no windows in the back. Bittaker found the perfect match, a silver 1977 GMC cargo van. No markings. No dents. No rust. It looked like the kind of van a handyman might use or someone hauling tools for work. And that's exactly what they were planning. Except their tools weren't for fixing anything. They were for breaking people. They nicknamed the van Murder Mac. It sounded like a joke at first. Something dark and stupid. But it stuck. The van became their hunting ground. Their mobile world. Inside it, they added the pieces, a mattress in the back, loose ropes, duct tape, screwdrivers, pliers, a sledgehammer, and eventually a cassette recorder. Before the killings, before even the first abduction, they practiced. They didn't want to make mistakes. They wanted to be perfect. Over the weeks that followed, they began cruising Southern California's beach towns. Hermosa Beach, Redondo, Torrance, neighborhoods where teens walked alone in the afternoons, heading home from school or killing time near the sand. The kind of places where no one noticed a van pulling up beside a sidewalk. They would stop, roll down the window, and talk to girls. Sometimes offering a ride. Sometimes just asking directions. They watched how girls reacted, how fast they walked, whether they looked nervous. They kept track of which streets were quiet, which roads had no witnesses. They even invited girls into the van but didn't hurt them. Not at first. These were test runs, drills, a way to build confidence, to learn timing. Control, how fast they could open the sliding door, how to move without drawing attention. These weren't just impulsive monsters acting on rage. They were studying, preparing. At night, Bittaker would park the van on side streets, just sitting there with the engine off, windows cracked, watching. Waiting. Sometimes for hours. He could be patient. He always had been. Norris, meanwhile, grew more agitated. He wanted to act. He had less control, less of Bittaker's cold detachment. He'd pace the van, shift in his seat. He craved the feeling they had discussed in prison, the power, the domination, the thrill. But Bittaker insisted they wait. He wanted everything to be perfect. They even picked their preferred age range, girls between 13 and 19. Teenagers. Young. Trusting. Easily overpowered. They made it a rule. A kind of twisted boundary that made it feel to them like a game. Rules helped them believe they were in control. That this was all just strategy, not sickness. And then they added the last piece. A tape recorder. Not for music. Not to play anything. To capture sound. They wanted to record everything. The begging. The crying. The pain. Later, they would replay the tapes. Relive the moments. Laugh. The cruelty wasn't just the violence. It was the attention to detail. And finally, by June of 1979, they decided they were ready. They had tested their methods, perfected their roles, Bittaker as the driver and con-talker, Norris as the muscle, the grabber. They had studied the van's layout, rehearsed how to restrain someone quickly, and mapped routes through neighborhoods with poor lighting. Now all they needed was a target, and on a warm afternoon in late June, they found one. June 24, 1979. It was a warm Sunday in Redondo Beach. The kind of day when the air smelled like salt water and tar from the pavement. 17-year-old Lucinda Lynn Schaefer had just attended a church service at St. Andrew's Presbyterian. She was quiet, thoughtful, kind. The type of girl who didn't hitchhike or take unnecessary risks. She was walking home alone, wearing a light summer outfit, her Bible tucked under one arm. She wasn't afraid of the neighborhood. This was her routine. Bittaker and Norris were already out in the van. They had spent the earlier part of the day cruising the area, looking, watching, waiting. They didn't expect to find someone like Lucinda so quickly. But when they saw her walking alone on a quiet stretch of sidewalk, they knew this was it. They drove past her once, then circled back. The street was empty. The sun had just started to lower, casting long shadows across the curb. There were no witnesses. No sounds except the distant hum of traffic and the chirping of birds. The van slowed. The side door was already unlocked. Bittaker stayed behind the wheel, calm, scanning the road ahead. Norris opened the door and moved fast. It happened in seconds. Lucinda was grabbed from behind and yanked inside the van. She fought, kicked, tried to scream. But Norris had already closed the door, and Bittaker hit the gas. They disappeared from the street before anyone could look twice. Just a van driving off into the fading daylight. Inside, the panic began. Lucinda begged them to let her go. She said she wouldn't tell anyone. She cried. She offered to forget everything. But they didn't answer. Bittaker kept driving, his hands steady on the wheel. Norris held her down, tying her wrists and ankles. They drove into the mountains, the San Gabriel Range, east of Los Angeles. An area they had scoped out weeks earlier. Remote, secluded, no homes. No hikers. Just rocks, trees, and dust. They parked near a fire road and dragged her out of the van. The sun had gone down by then. Insects buzzed in the brush. The temperature was starting to drop. Lucinda pleaded with them again. She told them she believed in God. She asked them why. Asked them what they wanted. What they wanted was control. Over the next several hours, both men took turns assaulting her. They didn't rush. They weren't frenzied or wild. They moved slowly, deliberately. At one point, Bittaker turned on the tape recorder. Lucinda kept her composure for as long as she could. Witnesses later said that what made her stand out was her strength, how she tried to reason with them, even in the middle of it all. She was dignified, calm, almost defiant. She refused to scream, refused to beg beyond the first hour. It angered Bittaker. He later told investigators that her refusal to scream made the experience boring. When they were finished with her, they debated what to do next. Norris wanted to strangle her quickly, end it. But Bittaker had another idea. He pulled a wire coat hanger from the van, wrapped it around her neck, and twisted it with a pair of vice grip pliers. Slowly, carefully, with mechanical precision. Lucinda Schaefer died in silence. They wrapped her body in a plastic shower curtain and carried it further up into the hills. There, beneath a cluster of shrubs and loose rocks, they left her unmarked, unburied, and alone. Then they got back in the van and drove away, as if nothing had happened. No one saw the van leave the mountains. No one reported it that night. Lucinda's parents waited for her to come home. Minutes turned into hours. Hours into days. They contacted the police. Passed out flyers. Called hospitals. But there was no trace. She had vanished. Like the others who would come after her. After Lucinda Schaefer, something shifted in both men. For Roy Norris, the act of murder brought a strange relief. He felt calmer afterward, as though he had released something that had been building for years. But for Lawrence Bittaker, it had the opposite effect. It wasn't enough. The silence, the control, the moment when life slipped away, it stirred something inside him. He wanted more. Not just more victims, but more intensity, more fear, more noise. They didn't wait long. On July 8, 1979, just 2 weeks after killing Lucinda, they found their next victim. Andrea Joy Hall, 18 years old, was hitchhiking along the Pacific Coast Highway. She had long brown hair, a soft voice, and plans for college in the fall. When the van pulled up beside her, Bittaker was once again behind the wheel. He smiled, offered her a ride. She got in. There was no struggle. Not at first. She thought she was safe. Bittaker drove a short distance, chatting casually, until Norris, who had been hiding in the back under a blanket, suddenly emerged. He grabbed her from behind and forced her down. She screamed this time. Tried to fight. But it was over within moments. They drove again into the San Gabriel Mountains. By now, they had a routine. Restraints. Assault. Recording. But with Andrea, Bittaker tried something different. After the first assault, he forced her to pose for photographs, using a Polaroid camera he'd recently bought. He made her smile, then frown, then kneel. He told her to act like she was enjoying it. He was controlling every frame. Andrea begged them to let her go. She said she wouldn't tell anyone. Promised. Cried. Prayed. Bittaker ignored her. He stabbed her with an ice pick behind the ear twice, then strangled her with the same wire and pliers method he had used before. The clinical, mechanical way he twisted the metal until her body stopped moving became his signature. To him, it was clean, efficient. They threw her body into a canyon. No marker. No name. By August, they were bolder. Next came Jackie Doris Gilliam, 15, and Leah Lamp, 13, to girls waiting at a bus stop near Hermosa Beach. They were carrying beach towels and snacks, likely heading to the pier. Bittaker offered them a ride. He was friendly, calm. They hesitated, but not for long. He said he could take them wherever they needed. The moment they were inside, Norris pulled out a gun. They were tied up quickly, mouths gagged. But something went wrong this time. Jackie managed to knock the gun from Norris's hand. There was a struggle. Screaming. She fought hard. So did Leah. But the van door was already closed. There was nowhere to go. They drove the girls into the mountains again. This time, they stayed overnight. It was the longest anyone had been kept alive. Both girls were tortured for hours, possibly longer. Investigators later found audio recordings of their screams. Some of the tapes included Bittaker's voice, instructing them to cry louder, to beg harder. He was playing a role director, tormentor, killer. He wanted their pain to be perfect. At some point during the night, he used pliers on Jackie's genitals. Then, after hours of this, he drove an ice pick into each girl's ear and strangled them. One body was thrown off a cliff, the other buried under rocks. But even that wasn't the end. By now, they were almost proud of what they were doing. They kept souvenirs, jewelry, hair, photos. They talked about their victims like trophies. Not people. Not even names. Just the blonde one or the fighter. Bittaker replayed the tapes when he was alone. Norris drank to cope. Their next victim came in October. Shirley Lynette Ledford was 16. She had just left a Halloween party and was walking alone near a gas station in Sunland. She wasn't hitchhiking. She wasn't looking for a ride. She was just trying to get home. Bittaker pulled up and recognized her. She had served him once at a local restaurant. She got in, probably thinking she was catching a ride from someone vaguely familiar. But Norris was in the back, waiting. What happened to Shirley would later be described as one of the most brutal crimes in California's history. Her screams, her terror, her final words, they were all captured on tape. And this time, they didn't even bother hiding her body. By November of 1979, the fear had settled in. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't always spoken out loud, but it was there, lingering. Parents in the South Bay region of Los Angeles started driving their daughters to school, even if it was just a few blocks away. Teenagers stopped walking alone at night. Teachers told students not to talk to strangers, even if they seemed polite. Especially if they seemed polite. But the problem was, no one knew what exactly to be afraid of. The missing girls hadn't come from the same street. They weren't the same age. They didn't look the same. Some had hitchhiked. Others hadn't. There was no obvious pattern, just a steady drip of absence. Girls who had been there and then weren't. For law enforcement, it was frustrating. Most of the girls were labeled runaways, at least at first. Some had histories of staying out late. Others had minor disciplinary records. None of them had been found, but there was no evidence of foul play. No blood, no bodies, no crime scenes, just silence. Until Shirley Ledford. On the morning of November 1st, her body was discovered on a suburban lawn in Sunland, an upper-middle-class neighborhood not used to waking up to police sirens. She had been dumped hastily, her limbs twisted unnaturally, her face bruised and swollen. Her injuries were horrifying, even to seasoned homicide detectives: bruises, contusions, a wire ligature still embedded in her neck. But what shocked the investigators most was what they didn't find: any attempt to hide her. No canyon. No tarp. No remote hill. She had been left in plain sight. As if someone wanted her to be found. As if someone was proud. The Los Angeles Police Department quickly launched a full-scale investigation. Forensics teams combed the area. Local news picked up the story within hours. Photos of Shirley circulated fast. Her classmates were interviewed. Her mother's voice, pleading through tears on television, struck a nerve with the public. This was no runaway. No misunderstanding. This was a murder, and a brutal one. Soon older cases were pulled back out of the filing cabinets. Lucinda Schaefer, Andrea Hall, Jackie Gilliam, Leah Lamp. The police started to wonder if these weren't isolated incidents. Maybe they had missed something. Maybe someone had been moving through their neighborhoods for months, hidden in a van, striking at random, leaving no trace. Still, they had nothing concrete, no plate numbers, no consistent witness descriptions, just fear. Meanwhile, Whitaker and Norris were growing bold, too bold. They talked about their crimes in casual tones, almost like jokes. Whitaker, especially, seemed to enjoy recounting the details. At parties, he would hint at things vague, disturbing stories that made people uncomfortable. He told one man he liked to watch girls die. Another time, he showed a Polaroid of a teenage girl bound and crying, claiming it was from a fun day in the desert. Some laughed nervously. Others changed the subject. But one man didn't forget. His name was Joseph Jackson. He was on parole himself. A petty criminal. Not someone most would call trustworthy. But he listened to Whitaker's stories, at first thinking they were jokes, then realizing they weren't. Whitaker even played him part of the cassette recording. Just a few seconds. That was enough. Jackson went home and thought about it. He debated staying quiet. But in the end, something made him pick up the phone. He called his parole officer. Said he had something the police might want to hear. When Joseph Jackson made that phone call, he wasn't entirely sure how serious things would get. He wasn't the kind of man police usually took seriously. He'd been arrested himself more than once. But what he heard on that cassette, it stayed with him. Not like a scary story or a disturbing joke, but like something rotten that had been opened in front of him. Something real. Something heavy. The parole officer listened carefully. Jackson explained that a man he knew, Lawrence Whitaker, had been saying some strange things. Bragging about hurting girls. About killing them. About recording it. He said Whitaker even played him part of a tape. The officer didn't dismiss it. He passed the tip along to the LAPD. It landed on the desk of Detective Paul Binham. At first, Binham was skeptical. People said all kinds of things in Los Angeles, especially people on parole. But he followed up. ran Bittaker's name. The man had a record. Assault. Burglary. Prison time. And so did his known associate Troy Norris. When they checked further, they found something even more interesting. Norris was on active parole, which meant they had leverage. Detectives reached out to him, brought him in quietly, sat him down in an interview room, just two folding chairs and a buzzing fluorescent light. He didn't know what they had. He didn't know who had talked. At first, he tried to stay calm, act confused. But it didn't take long. They told him they had a witness. They told him they'd heard about the tapes. And then they said one more thing. If he didn't cooperate, he'd take the full weight of it. Bittaker would walk, and Norris would ride. It worked. On November 20th, 1979, Roy Norris broke. And once he started talking, he didn't stop. He confessed to the entire series of crimes one by one. Gave names, dates, details that match missing persons reports. He told them about the van, about the toolbox, about the girls who cried and the ones who went silent too soon. He drew maps, pointed out where the bodies had been dumped. Most of all, he painted a picture of Bittaker as the mastermind, the cold one, the cruel one, the man who took pleasure in every part of it. He admitted that he had helped, that he had assaulted the girls, restrained them, even killed with his own hands. But he insisted it was Bittaker who led the way. Bittaker who chose the tools. Bittaker who brought the tape recorder. The police listened. Some had to step out of the room. The level of detail in Norris's confession was staggering. And when he told them about the tapes, where they were, what they contained, it gave the case a horrifying gravity. Armed with the confession, detectives obtained a search warrant for Bittaker's residence. Inside the apartment, they found what they were looking for. Photographs, jewelry, a bracelet belonging to Lucinda Schaefer, a cassette recorder, dozens of tapes. In the Van Murder Mac they found more. Ropes, wires, pliers, a sledgehammer. The mattress stained and worn. Strands of hair. Soil. Even a single teenage girl's earring lodged beneath one of the seats. There was no more doubt. It was real. Everything Norris had said confirmed, piece by piece. The horror they had imagined now had physical weight. Photographs to look at, sounds to hear, bodies to search for in the dry hills above Los Angeles. Still, there was one thing left to do. They had to arrest Bittaker. And when they did, they found him calm. He didn't run. He didn't scream. He acted surprised, of course acted like it was all some mistake. But the moment the handcuffs clicked into place, something in his expression went blank. As if a performance had ended. Once Lawrence Bittaker was in custody, the investigation shifted into something more methodical. It wasn't just about interviews or guesses anymore. Now there were rooms full of evidence, boxes of tape reels, photographs spread across desks. Detectives, who had once only imagined the worst, were now forced to look it in the face, frame by frame, second by second. The most damning evidence wasn't physical, though. It wasn't the pliers or the blood-stained mattress or the handwritten maps Norris had drawn. It was the audio. The cassette tapes, found inside Bittaker's apartment, labeled and stacked neatly like a personal collection. The first time someone pressed play, it didn't take long before they stopped the tape. The room fell quiet. The voices on the recording weren't frantic or panicked. They weren't trying to cover their tracks. They were clear, calm, methodical. Bittaker could be heard giving instructions, telling the girl, later confirmed to be Shirley Ledford, to scream louder, to let it out. His tone was almost cheerful. At one point, he laughed. Shirley's voice, by contrast, was raw, ragged. She begged, pleaded, cried for her mother. Veteran officers, some with decades on the force, couldn't make it past the first few minutes. One detective, after hearing the full tape once, walked out and vomited behind the building. Another never listened to it at all, refusing to put those sounds in his head. One female officer who tried to catalog the audio had to take a leave of absence after describing the screams as inhuman. But the recordings were more than horrific. They were damning. They proved premeditation, planning, enjoyment. There was no way to spin the narrative after that. These weren't moments of panic or uncontrollable rage. These were performances. Documented, rehearsed, repeated. Meanwhile, investigators followed the trails Norris had provided. He had drawn several maps showing where he and Bittaker had left the bodies. It wasn't easy. Many of the locations were remote, and time had worn away the surface signs. But slowly, surely, the landscape began to give back its secrets. Human remains were discovered in the San Gabriel Mountains, some buried shallowly beneath rock piles, others exposed to the elements. Dental records confirmed the identities: Lucinda Schaefer, Jackie Gilliam, and Leah Lamp. The condition of their remains matched the descriptions in Norris's confession almost exactly. Andrea Hall's body was never found, but enough had been recovered to seal the narrative. Enough to prove that what Norris described wasn't fiction. Each detail he provided was matched by something physical, something undeniable. The prosecution began building its case, starting with Roy Norris. Because he had confessed and agreed to testify against Bittaker, the district attorney offered him a deal: life in prison in exchange for full cooperation. Norris accepted. He became the key witness, the man who walked the jury through every brutal detail. And Bittaker, he denied everything. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence, he kept up the act, claimed the photos were staged, said the girls were willing participants, argued that the screams on the tape were fabricated sound effects. He said, a sick joke. But no one believed him, especially not the jury. Still, the system takes its time. Before the trial could begin, a series of hearings were held to determine whether the tapes could even be played in court. Defense attorneys argued they were too prejudicial, too disturbing to allow a fair trial. Prosecutors disagreed. They said the tapes were essential. The truth, however awful, had to be heard. After weeks of legal wrangling, the court ruled in favor of the prosecution. The tapes would be played. Not in full, but enough. Enough for 12 jurors to hear the sound of real terror. Enough to understand who Lawrence Bittaker really was. Not just a man who killed, but a man who reveled in suffering, who wanted to keep a record of it, replay it, control it forever. The trial date was set, and across Los Angeles, the name Toolbox Killers began appearing in headlines. What had once been whispers was now front-page news, and the public finally began to see the face of the man behind the wheel. The trial of Lawrence Bittaker officially began in early 1981. It had taken over a year of preparation, reviewing thousands of pages of evidence, collecting witness testimony, securing psychological evaluations, and preparing the jury for what they were about to hear. This was not a typical murder trial. It wasn't even a typical serial killer case. It was something darker, deeper. A kind of horror most people didn't want to believe could exist outside of fiction. From the moment Bittaker was brought into the courtroom, he seemed to relish the attention. Clean-shaven, calm, almost smug. He wore a suit, sat with his arms folded, whispered occasionally to his lawyers, but rarely showed emotion. When the prosecution began to describe the details, what had happened in the van, what the tapes revealed, he blinked slowly as if bored. The only time he reacted was when they mentioned the intelligence behind the crimes. Then he smiled, just faintly, like he was being complimented. Roy Norris, by contrast, never appeared in front of the jury. His cooperation had kept him out of the courtroom spotlight. Instead, his words were read aloud, his voice replayed from recorded interviews. He described every assault, every scream, every decision they had made. He told the jury that Bittaker kept the tapes because he wanted to hear the girls again, that he used them for his own pleasure, sometimes replaying them over dinner. It was almost too much to bear. Family members of the victims sat in the front row holding hands, clutching tissues, sometimes walking out when the audio began. Jurors wept openly. One had to be excused and replaced. Reporters in the gallery scribbled notes with pale faces, their headlines already writing themselves. The evidence was overwhelming. There were photographs, Polaroids of the girls taken during the assaults, their eyes swollen, wrists bound. There were audio recording short segments, played carefully by the prosecution to illustrate the cruelty without pushing the jury too far. And there were physical artifacts, pieces of jewelry, strands of hair, hand-drawn maps that matched the burial sites exactly. Even the van itself was part of the case. Murder Mac had been preserved, examined, and displayed as a twisted piece of physical testimony. Jurors were shown the interior, where the mattress had been, where the tools were kept, how the sliding door could be pulled shut in seconds. The prosecutors didn't need to dramatize it. The truth was graphic enough. Bittaker's defense team tried everything. They claimed the tapes were staged, that the girls were willing participants in some kind of bizarre consensual game, that Norris was the real manipulator and Bittaker had been led astray. But the strategy didn't work. It didn't explain the bodies. It didn't explain the condition of the remains. It didn't explain the consistency between what Norris had described and what investigators had found. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days. On March 24, 1981, Lawrence Bittaker was found guilty on all counts: 5 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of kidnapping, rape, and torture. The judge, visibly shaken during sentencing, called the crimes the most shocking and sadistic series of acts this court has ever encountered. Bittaker was sentenced to death. He showed no reaction. Just leaned back slightly in his chair, eyes on the floor, jaw set. Not angry. Not afraid. Just still. As for Roy Norris, he remained in state prison under a life sentence. Eligible for parole, technically, but with no realistic path to freedom. His name, forever tied to Bittaker's, was buried in the archives of the California Department of Corrections. He had escaped the death penalty, but not history, not memory. The public, meanwhile, couldn't stop talking about the case. News anchors described the trial in muted voices. Opinion columns debated the morality of the death penalty. Victim advocacy groups used the story as a rallying cry for tougher sentencing and increased monitoring of parolees. For a time, the toolbox killers were everywhere, on magazine covers and late-night news specials, in books and documentaries. But no one wanted to hear the full tapes. Even the journalists, who had access to them, chose not to publish the contents. Some things, they said, didn't belong in the public archive. Some things were too evil to echo. And in the years that followed, Bittaker became what he always wanted to be: infamous. A name spoken in hushed tones. A monster behind glass. And yet, even from death row, he continued to write letters to the press, to appeal his case, to insist, still, that it had all been misunderstood. But the evidence remained, and the screams still haunted those who heard them. Lawrence Bittaker spent the rest of his life on death row at San Quentin State Prison. Decades passed. Appeals were filed and denied. He never expressed remorse, never admitted guilt, never wavered in his twisted self-narrative. In interviews, he spoke about his crimes with cold detachment, sometimes smiling at his own words. He gave long, meandering explanations to anyone who would listen: journalists, researchers, even curious college students. But what he never gave was the truth. Not to the families, not to the investigators, not even to himself. He died of natural causes on December 13, 2019, at the age of 79. There was no public funeral, no memorial. Just a short announcement in the prison bulletin and a number added to a list. Roy Norris died earlier, in 2020, also behind bars. By then, few remembered his name. His deal with the prosecution had kept him off death row, but not out of history's shadow. He died a convicted murderer, a rapist, a man whose name was written in the margins of a case so horrifying that even seasoned officers refused to speak of it. The families of the victims never truly recovered. Some moved away from California. Others stayed, quietly tending to small memorials, worn photographs on Montel's birthdays remembered in silence. There were no real answers. No justice that felt equal to the pain. Just the long, echoing aftermath of something that never should have happened. And yet, it had. The story of the toolbox killers remains one of the most brutal and meticulously documented cases of torture and murder in American criminal history. Not just for what they did, but for how they did it. With planning, with patience, with intention. It reminded the world that evil doesn't always come with warning signs. Sometimes it's quiet, organized, smiling. Sometimes it drives a van and parks in your neighborhood. But sometimes it wears scrubs. In the mid-1990s, hundreds of miles away in a quiet veterans hospital in Northampton, Massachusetts, patients began dying unexpectedly. Not violently, not in back alleys or mountain canyons, but in sterile rooms under white sheets, surrounded by machines and the gentle beeping of monitors. They coded suddenly, without clear cause, flatlined even when their conditions hadn't been critical. At first, no one questioned it. After all, these were veterans, some old, some old. Death wasn't rare. But then someone noticed something strange. The deaths only happened on certain shifts. Nights, mostly. Quiet ones. And always when a particular nurse was working. Her name was Kristen Gilbert. She was calm. Professional. Smart. She smiled at patients, brought them extra blankets, checked their charts twice. And when she was around, people died. Kristen Heather Strickland was born on November 13, 1967, in Fall River, Massachusetts, a city most known for another infamous woman, Lizzie Borden. But no one expected anything dark or deadly from Kristen. She was bright, well-spoken, well-liked. Teachers described her as intelligent, though somewhat controlling. She was the kind of student who wanted things a certain way: tidy, correct, predictable. At home, she was the oldest of 2 daughters. Her parents, outwardly stable, were middle class and supportive. Kristen was disciplined, ambitious, and gifted in academics. But as she moved through her teenage years, she developed a reputation for being manipulative. Friends from high school would later recall how she enjoyed playing games with people's emotions. Nothing overtly cruel, just subtle acts. Small lies. Twisted stories. Attention-seeking behavior disguised as charm. She excelled in science and biology, and after graduation, chose to pursue nursing. It was a respectable field, a noble one. Helping people, saving lives. The kind of job that came with praise, appreciation, a clean white uniform, and a steady paycheck. She enrolled at Greenfield Community College and eventually earned her nursing degree. Soon after, she was hired at the Northampton Veterans Affairs Medical Center, quiet, well-regarded VA hospital nestled in the rolling hills of western Massachusetts. The hospital was calm, almost sleepy. Most of the patients were older veterans, men in their 60s, 70s, even 80s. Some were terminal. Others were recovering from surgeries, strokes, or chronic conditions. Many didn't have families nearby. They trusted the staff, relied on them. Most of all, they expected kindness and safety. Kristen Gilbert quickly stood out among her peers. She was efficient, detail-oriented, and had an almost effortless way with patients. She memorized their names, their preferences, their family histories. She brought them water without being asked, helped with shaving, made jokes, wrote neat, thorough notes in their medical charts. The other nurses respected her. The doctors praised her professionalism. But then, things started to happen. In the early 1990s, nurses in Ward C began noticing an uptick in codes, that is, code blues, medical emergencies involving cardiac arrest. Normally, these were rare. Perhaps 1 or 2 a month, depending on the ward. But suddenly, they were happening more often. Sometimes twice in one shift, other times on consecutive days. And always, it seemed, when Kristen was working. At first, no one connected the dots. Hospitals are busy places. Charts are imperfect. People make mistakes. And besides, Kristen was always the first to respond. She ran toward the emergency, not away from it. She administered CPR, summoned doctors, pushed medication. More than once, she was credited with saving a life. But some nurses started keeping track. Silently, they jotted down times, names, circumstances. And a strange pattern began to form. When Kristen was on shift, patients coded. When she wasn't, they didn't. It didn't make sense. She wasn't sloppy. She wasn't neglectful. On the surface, she was one of the best. But the numbers were impossible to ignore. The statistical spike in deaths, the surges in cardiac arrest, the eerie silence that returned whenever she took a vacation or had a day off. And then came the whispers. Not loud accusations. Just questions exchanged quietly between co-workers in the break room. Did you notice? Someone would ask. She was on again last night. Another nurse would nod, but say nothing. No one wanted to believe it. No one wanted to be the one to speak it aloud. Because accusing a nurse of murder, especially one like Kristen, wasn't just dangerous. It was unthinkable. But unthinkable things were already happening. And soon, they would only get worse. By the middle of 1995, the whispers had become harder to ignore. In Ward C, the heart of the Northampton VA Hospital's long-term care unit, something was happening, something that even the most seasoned nurses couldn't explain away. Patients were coding with increasing frequency, but only during certain hours. Only on certain days. And when Kristen Gilbert was off the schedule, those emergencies stopped. Entire weeks would pass without a single code blue. Then she'd return, and within hours, someone would crash. At first, nurses blamed coincidence. After all, hospitals are unpredictable places. Many patients in Ward C were in fragile condition. They had weakened immune systems, cardiovascular problems, postoperative complications. Sometimes people died without warning. Sometimes they coded and were revived. But this wasn't that. This was a rhythm. A pattern. And not just any pattern, but one tied directly to the presence of a single nurse. Kristen never seemed surprised when someone coded. She was always there close by, quick to act. Some nurses began to notice that she was often in the room just before it happened, or walking past, just seconds before a monitor flatlined. At first it looked like intuition, like she had a sixth sense for emergencies. But as the list of incidents grew, that explanation no longer held up. More troubling still, patients weren't just crashing, they were dying. In one stretch of just 7 months, from August 1995 to February 1996, the hospital recorded 37 code blues in Ward C alone, more than triple the usual number. At least 20 of those patients died. Some had been stable earlier that day. Others had been recovering well. The medication logs showed nothing unusual. No obvious medical cause. Just sudden cardiac arrest again. And again. Nurses began keeping informal records, handwritten notes, shift charts, patient logs. One nurse, wary of retaliation, quietly color-coded a calendar to track Kristen's schedule and the dates of every emergency. The result was undeniable. On days Kristen was absent, there were almost no emergencies. On the days she worked, there were spikes. Some nurses began avoiding working with her altogether. Others, more vocal, approached their supervisors. They brought printouts, data, shift reports. They didn't make direct accusations. No one wanted to be sued or worse, fired, but they asked questions, suggested audits, recommended transferring Kristen to another unit, at least temporarily. But the administration was cautious. Hospitals run on structure and hierarchy, and nurses, even the best ones, are rarely believed over protocol. Kristen had no disciplinary record. She was praised in evaluations. Doctors liked her. She had saved lives, they said. She was professional, responsible, a role model. More than that, she was one of them. And accusing someone like her meant acknowledging the unimaginable, that a caregiver might be a killer. Still, pressure mounted. In January 1996, an anonymous report was filed with hospital security. Not a formal complaint, but enough to raise concern. Around the same time, a cluster of suspicious deaths, including several involving patients with no clear risk of cardiac failure, was quietly flagged by the hospital's risk management team. Something wasn't right. One senior nurse finally went further. The official reason given was personnel reallocation, but everyone in Ward C knew. And then something strange happened. The code stopped. For weeks after Kristen's departure, there wasn't a single code blue in the unit. No unexplained deaths. No mysterious crashes. Just the normal flow of hospital life. That alone would have been enough to convince many, but what came next made it impossible to ignore. Kristen returned, briefly, quietly, just for a shift or two, and the same night she did, a patient coded and died. The moment Kristen returned to the hospital and another patient died, the administration could no longer ignore the warning signs. The risk was no longer theoretical. This wasn't just a pattern, it was a possible crime. Quietly, without public announcement, the hospital reached out to federal authorities. Because this wasn't just a local matter. The Northampton Veterans Affairs Medical Center was a federal facility, and the patients under its care were military veterans. Any investigation into criminal activity on the premises would fall under federal jurisdiction. Within weeks, The FBI was involved. The agents didn't storm into the hospital. They didn't announce themselves with badges and tape recorders. They began instead by interviewing staff one by one: nurses, physicians, pharmacists, administrators, janitorial staff, anyone who had worked in Ward C during the months in question. What they heard was unsettling and consistent. Time and again, staff pointed to Kristen Gilbert. Some described her as efficient, capable, and confident but cold. Others said she was manipulative, prone to mood swings, someone who needed attention and control. Most disturbingly, nearly everyone agreed that deaths followed her, not by days or weeks, sometimes by hours. Meanwhile, hospital pharmacy records were pulled and analyzed. Every drug administered in Ward C was logged down to the milligram. Investigators looked for patterns, inconsistencies, missing vials. And one name began to appear over and over again, tied to specific medications that should have been used sparingly, if at all. Epinephrine. Commonly known as adrenaline, epinephrine is a powerful cardiac stimulant. In small, precise doses, it can restart a failing heart. But in high amounts, especially when injected into a stable patient, it can do the opposite. It can cause the heart to spasm, to fail, to rest, and it leaves almost no trace. In the human body, adrenaline is produced naturally, especially during stress. After death, it degrades quickly. Unless specifically tested for, excess amounts are easy to miss, especially if the death doesn't appear suspicious. But now the deaths did. Federal investigators identified multiple cases where patients had no documented reason to receive epinephrine, yet it had been withdrawn under Kristen's name. In other instances, entire vials had gone missing from the hospital's medication storage, and only she had been on duty. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was enough for a court order. A small number of bodies were exhumed, men who had died during Gilbert's shifts, whose deaths had originally been attributed to natural causes. Their remains were carefully transported to forensic labs, where toxicologists worked to extract whatever chemical data had survived. The results were difficult to interpret. Adrenaline, by its nature, doesn't linger. But several of the exhumed patients showed elevated levels inconsistent with their conditions. These weren't men in cardiac distress. Their charts showed stable vital signs only hours before their deaths. Meanwhile, Kristen was beginning to feel the pressure. She hadn't been formally charged, but she wasn't blind to what was happening around her. She sensed the scrutiny, the sudden silence when she entered a room, the loss of eye contact. She had been a respected nurse, once praised for her bedside manner, and now her coworkers barely spoke to her. She began missing shifts, calling in sick. She told friends she was being targeted unfairly, that jealous coworkers were making things up, that hospital politics were turning her into a scapegoat. But she also began acting erratically. One night, she showed up at the hospital parking lot long after her shift had ended. She wasn't supposed to be there, but staff saw her wandering between cars, standing near the emergency entrance, staring at the building. Another time, a nurse came home to find her car vandalized, windows cracked, tires slashed. No proof it was Kristen, but the timing was hard to ignore. As the investigation deepened, Kristen did something no one expected. She checked herself into a psychiatric facility. Officially, it was for stress and depression, unofficially it looked like retreat. And for the FBI, that looked like fear. Because the closer they got to the truth, the more they saw the shape of something deliberate. Not random death, not medical error, but manipulation, performance, a desire to create crisis and then appear as the savior. It wasn't about convenience. It was about control. By early 1998, the evidence against Kristen Gilbert had grown from quiet suspicion into a structured case. It was no longer just circumstantial. Pharmacy logs, nurse shift patterns, death reports, missing vials of epinephrine, all of it began to form a picture. And while adrenaline leaves little chemical residue, motive leaves a trace. And hers was becoming unmistakable. The FBI in the U.S. Attorney's Office prepared federal charges for counts of first-degree murder stemming from deaths between 1995 and 1996, and 2 counts of attempted murder involving patients who had coded but survived. Kristen was arrested in July 1998 and brought into custody without incident. No outburst, no tears. She appeared calm, even poised, during booking. The media caught on quickly. The story was irresistible. An attractive nurse, accused of secretly killing elderly veterans inside a federal hospital. Headlines called her the Angel of Death. News vans parked outside the courthouse. Journalists descended on Northampton, looking for former co-workers, classmates, family members, anyone who might explain how a caregiver could become a killer. The prosecution didn't rely on forensic features. They relied on people, nurses, doctors, pharmacists, hospital administrators. Dozens of witnesses took the stand and gave detailed accounts of Kristen's behavior during her shifts. Some cried. Others struggled to contain their disgust. They described how she always seemed to be there just before a patient crashed, how she'd linger near the crash cart, how she inserted herself into emergencies, sometimes taking charge, even when others were present and more experienced. One nurse described seeing Kristen inject something into a patient's for moments before he coded. At the time, it had happened too fast to question. In the courtroom, it became pivotal. Another witness, a former romantic partner of Gilbert's, said Kristen had admitted almost proudly that she'd helped things along for certain patients, that she liked being needed, that chaos gave her a sense of power. And then came the numbers. Statisticians brought in by the prosecution presented a clear analysis. During Kristen's shifts, the rate of code blue incidents increased by a factor of more than 4. The probability of this happening by chance, less than 1 in a million. The charts were displayed on courtroom monitors, lines spiking dramatically every time Kristen appeared on the schedule. But perhaps the most chilling testimony didn't come from an expert. It came from a nurse who had once worked alongside her on the night shift. She said Kristen didn't look stressed during emergencies. She didn't look afraid or panicked. She looked excited, focused. Her hands steady. Her expression flat. And afterward, she would linger near the nurse's station, quietly watching as the room buzzed with activity, as if the aftermath gave her satisfaction. The defense, meanwhile, tried to frame the case as a witch hunt. They claimed the hospital was trying to scapegoat Gilbert to cover up institutional errors, that patients were already critically ill, that adrenaline was given in good faith to try to save lives, not take them. They called attention to the lack of direct physical evidence, no fingerprints on syringes, no surveillance video, no confession. But the circumstantial case was overwhelming. And then prosecutors introduced a new element: Kristen's writings, diaries, letters, notes. Some were casual. Others revealed something more unsettling. In one letter to a former lover, she wrote of being there when people go, and described the quiet power of having a patient's life in her hands. She spoke of attention, recognition, adoration, and perhaps most damningly, she seemed to frame the deaths as a tool, something she could use to control her environment, to draw others closer. especially one man in particular, a hospital security officer with whom CD had a romantic relationship. He, too, took the stand. And what he described wasn't love, it was manipulation. Kristen, he said, thrived on crisis. When they were together, she seemed most alive when something bad was happening at the hospital. She'd call him during codes, ask him to come see her. And afterward, she'd be affectionate, more connected, as if tragedy was her love language. That was the core of the prosecution's theory. Kristen Gilbert didn't kill because she hated. She didn't kill out of rage or revenge. She killed to feel something, to be seen, to play the hero. As the trial moved into its final weeks, the tone inside the courtroom shifted. What began as a slow, methodical presentation of evidence had become emotionally charged, even fragile. The jurors, once curious, even skeptical, now sat with lowered eyes. Some had stopped taking notes. Others winced visibly during testimony. It wasn't the kind of trial where people argued loudly or shouted across the aisle. It was quiet, heavy. Each day felt like adding another stone to a growing pile. The closing arguments reflected that weight. The prosecution laid out their case not with flourish, but with precision. They described a nurse who craved more than just validation, someone who needed crisis, who fed on the adrenaline of death and revival, who wanted to be seen as a savior but operated as a predator. They walked the jury back through the numbers, the charts, the shift patterns, and finally, the names. The patients who had come into the hospital expecting care and had left in body bags. Men who had served their country, who trusted the system, who were vulnerable. And Kristen, they said, had exploited that trust not once, not twice, but again and again. The defense countered with their original position, reasonable doubt. They argued that correlation didn't equal causation, that the VA hospital was poorly managed, that other nurses had also been on duty during some of the codes, and that no one had seen Kristen inject a fatal dose. They reminded the jury that there were no autopsies for many of the patients, and that the few that had been exhumed provided inconclusive results. They tried to reframe the statistics as coincidence, the witness accounts as bias, and the love letters as harmless dramatics. But the jury had already seen too much. They had heard the recordings of the 911 call Kristen made when she believed police were coming for her, how her voice shook, how she hung up mid-sentence. They had read her handwritten notes about playing the angel and being the one they thanked later. They had sat through hours of testimony from coworkers who described a woman not overwhelmed by death, but energized by it. And they had listened in silence, as families of the dead took the stand, not to accuse, but simply to speak, to talk about fathers and grandfathers who had gone into the hospital alert, talkative, even laughing, and had died without explanation. The media, meanwhile, waited just outside the courthouse. Camera crews clustered on the steps. Reporters filed daily recaps with phrases like America's deadliest nurse and the VA murders. The story had gripped the country not because of its body count, but because of the betrayal. Hospitals were supposed to be places of healing. Nurses were supposed to be the ones who sat by your bed when the machines started to beat, not the ones who made them beat in the first place. When the jury was finally dismissed for deliberation, there was an unusual hush in the courtroom. No rustling papers. No side conversations. Even the judge looked exhausted. The trial had lasted over a month. Witness after witness. Chart after chart. More than 70 people had testified. Now, it was in the hands of 12 strangers. They were sequestered, removed from the world, given transcripts, instructions, and a windowless room. No phones, no newspapers, just the facts and their duty to interpret them. Outside, the public waited. The VA community veterans, nurses, families watched nervously. Some hoped for justice. Others feared what it would mean if she were acquitted. Would it suggest that the system had failed again? That the evidence, though compelling, wasn't enough? Inside that jury room, the debate wasn't about whether the death had happened. It was about intent. Could Kristen Gilbert, quiet, composed, professional Kristen, have really done this on purpose? Could someone take lives not for money, not out of hatred, but for attention, for excitement, for control? And if so, what kind of punishment did that deserve? The jury deliberated for 6 days. It was longer than some expected. The evidence was strong. The testimonies were powerful. But the weight of deciding whether a nurse had murdered 4 patients and attempted to kill 2 more wasn't something the jurors carried lightly. When they returned to the courtroom, their expressions gave little away. No glances, no tears. Just stillness. Kristen Gilbert sat motionless at the defense table, her hands folded in front of her. Her hair was pulled back tightly, her expression unreadable. She didn't flinch as the foreperson read the verdict aloud. Guilty on all counts of murder. Guilty on all counts of attempted murder. The courtroom was still. No gasps, no sobs. Only the soft sound of chairs shifting as people sat back in stunned finality. The judge, known for his reserved demeanor, spoke slowly during sentencing. He called the crimes a betrayal of the deepest kind, and said that Gilbert had used her position not just to access victims, but to shield herself from suspicion. She was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Afterward, she was led away in silence, her steps slow, the chain at her ankles clicking faintly with each movement. She would spend the rest of her life in a correctional facility in Texas, far from the small Massachusetts town where she once smiled at patients and brought them blankets. The hospital changed after that. Policies were updated. Oversight was tightened. Nurses were retrained. But the sense of trust, the quiet comfort of being watched over in a place of healing, never quite returned. Not fully. And for the families of the men who died, the verdict brought no real relief. Only a kind of still ache. One that doesn't scream, but lingers. The kind of pain that can't be measured in court documents or press statements. Just the echo of what was lost and the slow, steady knowledge that it didn't have to happen. The case faded from headlines eventually. New stories took its place. New names, new faces, new tragedies. But the question it left behind remained: how close can someone be, without us ever knowing who they really are? Because monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they wear scrubs. Sometimes they drive a van. And sometimes they smile from the passenger seat. In the spring of 1977, a 20-year-old woman named Colleen Stan stood on the side of a California highway with her thumb out. She wasn't scared. She had done it before, hitchhiked. That is, back then, it wasn't uncommon. It was fast. It was free. And Colleen, young and adventurous, was on her way to visit a friend for a birthday celebration. A few cars passed her by. A couple of them looked suspicious to many men, windows too dark. She let those go. Trusted her instincts. Then a small, beat-up blue car pulled over. A couple sat in the front, young, quiet, looking clean. The woman held a baby in her arms. They smiled. Said they were headed the same direction. It felt safe. Colleen got in. What she didn't know was that she had just entered the beginning of one of the most haunting captivity cases in modern history. One that wouldn't end for more than 7 years. Because she wasn't just getting a ride. She was about to disappear into silence, into darkness, into a box no one would find, And for the next 7 years, that's exactly where she would live. Colleen Stan was 20 years old when she vanished. In 1977, she was living in Eugene, Oregon, sharing an apartment with friends, working part-time jobs, and enjoying the freedom of early adulthood. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't naive. She was intelligent, independent, and cautious in the ways that mattered. But like many people her age at the time, she had a trust in the world that hadn't yet been broken. She liked meeting people. She believed in adventure. And she believed in reading people's intentions. That April, she decided to hitchhike down to Northern California to visit a friend in Westwood for her birthday. The plan was simple: a few hours on the road, some cake and conversation, and then back by the weekend. She packed light jeans, a t-shirt, a toothbrush, and a small bag. Her friend was expecting her. No one thought twice. Colleen had hitchhiked before. She knew how to be careful. She avoided cars with more than one man. Trusted her gut. Turned down a couple rides earlier that morning, one from a group of young guys, another from a man who wouldn't stop asking questions. Then a blue Dodge Colt pulled over. A young couple sat inside, a man driving, a woman in the passenger seat holding a baby on her lap. The baby was cooing. The woman smiled. The man looked clean-cut, quiet. The car was small and slightly dusty, but not run down. There was something calm about the whole scene. Colleen hesitated only briefly before sliding into the back seat. The man said they were headed toward Red Bluff along the same route Colleen needed. He introduced himself as Cameron. The woman said her name was Janice. The baby didn't have a name to offer, but smiled anyway. The windows were cracked. The radio played softly. At first, the ride felt normal. They talked about the weather, about road construction, about the baby. Colleen watched the scenery past the fields, the pine trees, the wide blue sky stretching above the two-lane road. She felt lucky. It's not every day you catch a ride with a nice couple and a baby. It made her feel safer, like she'd made the right choice. But then something shifted. Cameron missed a turn. He said he wanted to take a detour to see some nearby ice caves. A strange suggestion. They weren't on the way. But he said it casually, like it was nothing. Janice didn't react. Just looked out the window. Colleen felt the first small flicker of unease, but it passed. Maybe they were just friendly, curious. People do things like that sometimes. A few minutes later, Cameron pulled the car off the highway and down a dirt road. The baby was quiet. Janice was still. Colleen's instincts were starting to press harder now. The road narrowed, became bumpier. Trees closed in on both sides. There were no signs. No traffic. Nothing but branches brushing against the windows. When the car finally stopped, Cameron stepped out. Said he needed to check something near the trunk. Colleen watched through the window as he opened it and saw something strange. A wooden box, large, rectangular, with latches. She didn't know what it was. Maybe a toolbox. Maybe something for camping. She didn't ask. But in moments, everything changed. Cameron opened the back door and reached for her. Not violently. Not shouting, calmly. Deliberately. Colleen barely had time to register what was happening before he placed a blindfold over her eyes and something over her head, a padded device. Homemade, that muffled sound and sight. She felt herself being pulled forward. The world went dark. Her heart raced. She tried to speak, but her voice was swallowed by the thick silencer on her. She wasn't in danger anymore. She was already gone. The box she had seen wasn't for tools. It was for her. When Colleen Stan woke up, she wasn't in a bed or a room or even a building. She was inside a box. Wooden. Crude, lined with carpet and foam, just large enough for her body to lie flat. She couldn't sit up, couldn't stretch, could barely move her arms. There were holes drilled in the sides for air, but they didn't let in light. It was dark. Dry. Silent. At first she thought it was temporary, a threat, a punishment, some act of intimidation meant to scare her into compliance. She believed, at least in the first hours, that they would eventually open the lid and let her go, or talk to her, or explain. But they didn't. They kept her there for hours. Then hours turned into an entire day. She wasn't allowed to speak. Every time she tried, she was met with silence or worse, the dull thump of the lid being slammed shut again. Time became blurry. She had no sense of day or night, no understanding of where she was, no idea how long she'd been in the dark. Eventually, they opened the box, and the real captivity began. Cameron Hooker was not just a kidnapper. He was a planner, a believer in structure. He didn't just want a woman in his control, he wanted to build a system around her, one in which she would cease to think of herself as a person. He told her calmly that she was now his slave, that she would do as he said, that she had no identity anymore. Her name was gone. Her voice was not hers to use unless given permission. Janice, his wife, said nothing. She stood beside him during these early moments, often watching with a distant expression, neither fully engaged nor fully detached. Colleen would later learn that Janice had once been in the same position, that Cameron had forced her into acts of submission and violence, too, that she had participated now, because it was the only way to stop it from returning to her. In those first few weeks, Colleen learned the rules. There were to be no questions, no complaints, no resistance. When she was let out of the box, it was for two reasons: to be used or to be taught. Cameron explained that she was being trained, that she belonged to an organization, something he called the company, a shadowy, powerful group that supposedly monitored her every move, knew where her family lived, and would torture or kill her loved ones if she disobeyed. It was a lie, of course, but Colleen had no reason to doubt it. Her world had been reduced to four wooden walls and the voices of her captors. She had no sunlight, no clocks, no escape. Fear reshaped her mind faster than any rope or threat ever could. Cameron began calling her Kay, stripped her of her clothing, her privacy, her dignity. He drafted a contract, an actual, typed document declaring her his property. He made her sign it. She did. Not because she believed in its legality, but because she had been broken down so far that it didn't matter anymore. She would sign anything if it meant the day wouldn't end in pain. He kept her in the box for up to 23 hours a day. The box, at first, was stored in the basement. Later, it would move beneath their bed, hidden from sight. He'd place it under the frame covering the entry with a removable panel. For Janice and Cameron, life would continue as usual: dinner, TV, phone calls. And just inches below them, Colleen lay in silence, unmoving and seen. When she was let out, it wasn't for error or kindness. It was for control. Cameron inflicted pain to test boundaries. Sometimes physical, sometimes psychological. He spoke to her gently, then punished her for breathing wrong. He alternated between threats and praise, between pretending to be her savior and acting as her executioner. It was all part of the system. The longer it went on, the less Colleen resisted. Not because she agreed, but because resistance didn't feel like an option anymore. She began to adapt, to learn his moods, to memorize the sounds of the house, the creak of the stairs, the rhythm of his boots, the tone in his voice when he was about to snap. Survival meant becoming invisible, obedient, predictable. Cameron had no plans to let her go. And Colleen was beginning to believe she might never leave. As the weeks turned into months, and the months into years, the outside world began to lose its shape. For Colleen Stan, time had no structure, no calendar, no daylight, no weekends, no holidays. Only darkness, interrupted by brief, tightly controlled moments of light. The box beneath the hooker's bed became her entire world, a world that offered no sense of future, only the steady, smothering repetition of survival. Inside the box, she couldn't stretch. She couldn't sit up. The air holes drilled into the wood let in just enough oxygen to breathe, but not enough to feel fresh. The space was narrow and lined with padding, designed to muffle sound. She heard almost nothing from the outside, no footsteps, no birds, no conversations. Just the occasional scrape of movement above her, Janice shifting in bed, Cameron getting up in the morning, the soft creak of floorboards that marked the rhythm of a life that was not hers. During the day, Colleen was kept inside. During the night, sometimes, she was let out. Not for freedom, but for function. Cameron Hooker believed in systems. He treated Colleen like a machine with a single purpose, to serve. Sometimes she was made to clean, to cook, to carry out chores in silence. Other times she was used as an object of pleasure or punishment depending on his mood. There were days when he barely acknowledged her, and nights when he spoke to her as if she were a child. And always Janice hovered nearby, not intervening, not encouraging, just present, watching. Enduring. Colleen was not allowed to speak unless spoken to. She referred to Cameron as master. She signed her name with the letter J. She was given a bucket for waste and permission to use it only at certain times. She was allowed to bathe once every few weeks under supervision. Meals were infrequent and simple. Sometimes just bread. Other times nothing at all. Cameron controlled every detail of her existence, not just with force, but with rules. And when those rules were broken even slightly, there were consequences. Pain, humiliation, more time in the box. The psychological tactics were worse than the physical ones. Cameron continued to speak about the company, reinforcing the idea that Colleen was being watched at all times. He told her that the company could hear her thoughts, that they had agents on every street, that if she tried to escape or even imagined escape, they would come for her family, that they would hurt her little sister, that her parents would be tortured slowly. It was a fantasy, but Colleen believed it. Why wouldn't she? For her, reality had long since become a series of fictions crafted by a man who never broke character. He printed fake documents, drafted contracts, quoted invisible rules. Janice corroborated every story, and in the absence of any outside information, Colleen's mind began to adjust, not in acceptance but in compliance. She became what he demanded, quiet, obedient, compliant, but beneath that silence, she was still alive. She created systems of her own. She counted the seconds between footsteps, learning to track the passage of time by sound alone. She memorized the sound of birds when she was brought outside, briefly how they changed with the seasons. She used her breath to calm herself, turning her heartbeat into a metronome when panic crept in. She repeated phrases silently in her head to maintain language. She recited memories so they wouldn't fade: her mother's face, her friend's laugh, the exact color of the sky the day she left home. Sometimes Cameron would give her a reward, a book, a blanket. permission to sleep outside the box for a night on the floor, chained. These rewards were never random. They were part of his conditioning. Whenever Colleen followed an order perfectly, or passed one of his twisted tests, he made her feel it had earned her something human. That was the worst cruelty of all. He taught her to crave basic kindness, to wait for scraps of mercy. And in doing so, he kept her controlled not just by fear, but by hope. The hope that maybe, if she was good enough, quiet enough, small enough, he wouldn't need the box anymore. But the box always returned, always. And Colleen, day after day, slid herself back inside without protest. Because now the worst thing wasn't the box itself. The worst thing was what might happen if she resisted. By the 3rd year of captivity, something in the routine began to shift. Colleen was still sleeping in the box most nights. Still chained. Still silenced. But now, occasionally, she was allowed small freedoms. Cameron started letting her spend more time outside the container, first for minutes, then hours. He assigned her additional chores: laundry, gardening, food preparation. She was even permitted to leave the bedroom unaccompanied, so long as she remained silent and returned on time. To an outsider, this might have seemed like the beginning of leniency. To Colleen, it was something more dangerous. It was trust, a kind she had learned to fear, because trust came with expectation. Any misstep would break it, and breaking it meant punishment: days locked in the box, sometimes without food or light, left to shiver and replay her mistake over and over again. So when Cameron began granting her limited access to the backyard, or short walks around the property, she didn't see opportunity. She saw another test, a way to fail. Then came something unthinkable. In 1981, 4 years after her abduction, Cameron told her he was taking her out in public. He said she had proven herself, that she had earned it, and that, as long as she followed every instruction, everything would be fine. He let her shower, gave her clean clothes, told her to speak only when spoken to, and never to mention the company, not unless she wanted to see what they would do to her family. Colleen nodded. She didn't run. She didn't scream. He drove her to visit his parents. They ate dinner at the table. Smiled. Asked polite questions. Colleen answered them. Quietly. Politely. As if nothing were wrong. She didn't even glance at the door. She didn't need to. Because escape didn't feel like an option, not with the company watching, not with the belief that her every breath was being recorded, that her every glance would be interpreted as rebellion. Cameron had told her she was being monitored. And Colleen believed him. Later, he began letting her walk outside by herself, to collect mail, to water plants, even to jog once around the neighborhood. Still shackled emotionally, but not physically. She passed neighbors. People waved. She waved back. No one suspected anything, because she didn't look like a prisoner. She looked like a quiet, reserved young woman. Pale, thin perhaps, but calm, composed. There were even moments when she could have fled. She knew that. She passed phones, doors, cars. There were people she could have spoken to. But she didn't, not once, because her mind was still in the box even when her body was outside of it. Over time, Cameron gave her more. A small journal, a Bible, permission to write letters though none would be sent. He even let her call her family once, under supervision. It was brief, measured. She said she was fine, that she was happy, living with a traveling religious group. Her mother cried, told her they missed her, asked if she was safe. Colleen said yes. When the call ended, Cameron praised her. She had passed the test. But it wasn't loyalty. It was conditioning. She had been trained methodically, painfully to suppress instinct, to detach action from agency, to filter every decision through one question. Will this bring pain? If the answer was yes, she didn't move. This is what psychological captivity looks like. A prison built not from locks and fences, but from fear. A box that doesn't need nails once it's been installed in the mind. By 1983, Colleen had spent 6 years in captivity. 6 years of darkness, of silence, of submission. She had become a ghost in her own life, trained not just to obey but to disappear. And yet, despite the depth of control Cameron Hooker had achieved, something was changing. Not rapidly, not in some cinematic escape sequence, but in small, quiet fractures, hairline cracks in the armor of his dominance. The first crack came from Janice. For years, she had stood silently beside her husband, complicit in his sadistic fantasy. She had helped maintain the illusion of the company, enforced the rules, prepared Colleen's meals, and watched her crawl in and out of the box like a servant girl in a medieval cellar. But Janice was not made of stone. The lies had worn thin. The guilt had begun to seep through the cracks in her composure. She had once been under Cameron's control too. He had bound her, silenced her, broken her down. Her compliance was not born of malice, but of exhaustion, of surviving alongside a man whose thirst for domination was masked by soft speech and careful routines. By the 6th year, Janice was crumbling. She began pulling away emotionally. Her marriage was fraying. Cameron, once satisfied with having Colleen as his second wife, had become more erratic, demanding, distant. He still claimed to love Janice, but more and more of his attention was focused on Colleen. Not just physically but symbolically. He saw himself as a creator, a godlike figure who had shaped a woman into silence, built a new being from obedience. But Colleen, quiet, trained, passive, had not stopped thinking. Even when she believed escape was impossible, she had continued to observe. She had learned patterns, memorized layouts. She began to notice how Cameron's routine shifted when he was angry or when he felt insecure. She watched how Janice flinched when he raised his voice. And though she still feared the consequences of rebellion, another feeling had begun to take root, one she hadn't felt in years. What if there was no company? What if the eyes weren't watching? What if everything, the rules, the threats, the invisible agents, had been fiction? The realization wasn't sudden. It didn't arrive like a thunderclap. It arrived slowly, wrapped in questions he no longer had the energy to suppress. Why had the company never intervened when she dropped a spoon? Why did she never see any actual evidence, any signs at all that someone besides Cameron and Janice knew she existed? Janice noticed. And for the first time, the two women began to exchange something other than instructions and glances. They exchanged trust. It started with small talk, neutral topics, soft moments. Janice didn't tell Colleen the truth immediately. She couldn't, but she also didn't reinforce the lie with the same conviction. She stopped repeating certain threats. She paused longer before answering when Colleen asked questions. And then, one day, something changed. Cameron was at work. The house was quiet. Janice approached Colleen and said, softly, "There is no company." There never was. The words didn't land all at once. At first, Colleen simply stared. It sounded like a trick, a test. But Janice said it again. This time slower, clearer. "They're not watching." It was all Cameron. He made it up. It was the moment the box began to break from the inside. Fear doesn't evaporate easily. It lingers, even after the threat is gone. But doubt is powerful. It loosens the rope, cracks the door, gives shape to possibilities that once seemed unimaginable. In the days that followed, Janice opened up. She told Colleen everything. How Cameron had manipulated her from the beginning. How she had watched him build the box, draft the fake contracts, invent the company. How she had gone along with it out of fear, then guilt, then numb routine. And how she could no longer bear it. She was done. And she wanted to help. Colleen listened, unsure of what to feel. Hope, maybe, but mostly disbelief. After all these years, after hundreds of nights in the dark, the truth felt surreal, like a hallucination. But the door was opening. And this time, maybe, she would step through it. In August of 1984, 7 years after the ride that changed her life, Colleen Stan stepped outside and kept walking. She wasn't running. She wasn't escaping in the middle of the night. She had been given permission. Cameron had allowed it. He said she could visit her family for the weekend. He believed she wouldn't tell them anything. That the conditioning still held. That the company still lived inside her head, even if Janice had begun pulling away from the illusion. And to some degree, he was right. Colleen had permission, and still she didn't tell. She took a bus from Red Bluff to her parents' home in Riverside. It was the first time they had seen her in years. Her hair was longer, her frame thinner, her voice quieter. But she smiled, said she was okay, that she had joined a group, been traveling. She didn't mention the box, or the beatings, or the lies. Her mother was just happy to see her again. They talked for hours, cooked together, watched television. But Colleen didn't break. Not then. Not yet. The fear hadn't vanished. It had simply grown quieter, like a fire banked under ash, still hot enough to burn. After the visit, she went back. Back to the house. Back to Cameron. Back to the box. It doesn't make sense to most people. Why would someone do that? Why, when freedom was in her hands, would she return to the man who had stolen everything from her? But that's what psychological captivity looks like. It isn't chains. It's belief. It is a web of threats and illusions so tightly woven that even when the door is open, stepping through it feels like death. Colleen believed that leaving forever meant risking the lives of her family. Even though Janice had told her the truth, even though the company was fiction, the fear remained. She hadn't yet rebuilt enough of herself to override it. But something had changed. Janice had seen it in her eyes. The shift was real. And this time, it would last. 2 months later, Janice took action. Not Colleen, not the police, not a neighbor or a detective. Janice. She gathered her strength, packed her things, and left Cameron Hooker for good. She took their 2 children, checked into a hotel, and called a pastor, a man she trusted, someone outside the chaos. And to him, she told everything. The pastor listened, asked questions, and then he called the police. Within days, Janice was sitting in an interview room with detectives, describing in measured, sometimes trembling detail what had happened for the last 7 years. The box, the false company, the signed contracts, the torture, the control, the silence. The investigators listened, skeptical at first, then horrified. They sent a team to locate Colleen. She was still with Cameron, though not imprisoned. She was sleeping in a regular room now. allowed to eat at the table, to walk freely. But the lines of control hadn't vanished. They were still present in her voice, in the way she deferred to him, and how she paused before speaking. When agents approached her and asked if she was safe, Colleen hesitated, then nodded. They asked again, and the second time, something cracked. She said no. And just like that, it was over. 7 years of captivity ended not with a midnight chase, or a broken lock, or a secret message hidden under floorboards, but with a whisper. A truth finally spoken out loud. Cameron Hooker was arrested on November 18, 1984. He denied everything. Said Colleen had stayed by choice. That she was never forced. That she had even loved him. But the evidence said otherwise. And the box still hidden under the bed spoke louder than any denial ever could. Cameron Hooker went to trial in 1985. The evidence was overwhelming. Photographs, witness testimony. The box itself exhibited in court, placed on the floor like an open coffin. Jurors walked past it in silence, seeing not just a wooden structure, but the place where a woman had lived for 7 years. No one spoke. Some covered their mouths. Others looked away. Colleen took the stand. Her voice was even. She spoke carefully, slowly, describing what had been done to her not with anger, but with a quiet steadiness that made the courtroom still. She described the box, the silence, the contracts, the fear. She didn't cry, and she didn't need to. Her words carried all the weight. Cameron sat across from her, showing no emotion. He still claimed it had all been consensual, that she had stayed because she wanted to, that she had loved him. But the jury didn't believe him. They deliberated for just a few hours. He was found guilty on multiple counts, including kidnapping and sexual assault, and sentenced to over 100 years in prison. He remains incarcerated to this day. Janice Hooker, in exchange for her cooperation, was granted full immunity. She changed her name and disappeared from public life. Some say she returned to religion. Others say she never truly left the shadows of what had happened. She was never charged. But she was never quite free either. Colleen Stan tried to move forward. She earned a degree, worked with trauma victims, spoke publicly only a few times, always with the same tone, soft but deliberate. She refused to let what happened define her entirely. But she also never denied what it had taken from her. And even decades later, people struggled to understand how such a thing could happen. How someone could live in a box under bed for 7 years and no one knew. But sometimes the most disturbing crimes happen behind ordinary doors. Sometimes the monster doesn't shout or scream. He smiles. He eats dinner. He plays with his kids. He goes to work. And sometimes he just lives alone. In an apartment in Milwaukee. Quiet, polite. Friendly to neighbors. No one knew what was inside his freezer. No one knew what was hidden behind the bedroom door. But the smell, they said, was hard to ignore. And when the police finally walked in, they didn't just find a killer. They found a museum of death. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21st, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. On the surface, his early years were unremarkable, quiet neighborhood, modest house, middle-class family. His father, Lionel, was a chemist. His mother, Joyce, struggled with anxiety and bouts of depression. They argued often, sometimes loudly, and as the marriage deteriorated, so did the emotional temperature inside the home. But nothing about the house screamed danger. not from the outside. Jeffrey, as a child, was quiet, not particularly social, but not completely isolated either. Teachers described him as polite, though disengaged. He rarely misbehaved, rarely spoke unless spoken to. There were no outbursts, no tantrums, just stillness. But stillness can hold strange things. At the age of 4, after a minor hernia surgery, something shifted. Those around him noted a change in his demeanor. He became more withdrawn, more distant, as if the experience had flipped some invisible switch. His father would later describe this moment as a beginning not of violence, but of vacancy, a boy receding into himself. By the time Jeffrey was in elementary school, he had developed a fascination with dead animals. Not just curiosity, not just the innocent kind of wonder that some children feel when they find a bird in the grass. He collected roadkill, frogs, squirrels, bones. He stored them in jars, sometimes in the backyard, sometimes beneath the porch. He dissected them, studied them, watched how their bodies broke down. He wasn't cruel, not in the traditional sense. He didn't kill pets or torture animals for sport. He was interested in process, in decay, in the way flesh separated from bone. He told his father he wanted to understand how things worked. Lionel, a chemist, even encouraged this interest, at first bought him dissection kits, showed him how to handle lye and acids, unaware of what this curiosity would later become. At school, Jeffrey kept to himself. He had trouble connecting. He laughed at strange moments. Sometimes he would mimic seizures or slurred speech, trying to get reactions from classmates. A kind of forced attention. He wasn't violent. He wasn't threatening. He was just strange. The kind of kid teachers worried about quietly, but never reported. The kind who slipped through unnoticed because he wasn't loud enough to cause alarm. By high school, his isolation deepened. He drank a lot, sometimes showing up to class visibly intoxicated. His classmates nicknamed him the Dahmer. He made odd jokes, mocked teachers, pulled pranks. But behind the facade of awkward humor, the silence was thickening. He began to have fantasies, dark ones, about men, about control, about bodies. He didn't act on them yet, but they were there, growing, taking shape. At home, things weren't much better. His parents' marriage collapsed. His mother left. His father remarried. Jeffrey stayed behind in the same house, drifting, unsupervised, unmoored. He graduated, barely, with no plans for college. Just a mounting sense of disconnection, as if he were watching life through a pane of glass. He joined the army in 1979, was stationed in Germany, and even there across the ocean, among new faces and rigid discipline, he didn't fit in. He drank, failed to follow orders, was discharged after 2 years, not dishonorably, just quietly, sent back to the States with no ceremony, no plan. He bounced between jobs, lived with his grandmother for a time, took up cooking, yard work, late-night walks. He seemed harmless. Lonely, maybe, shy. He worked in a chocolate factory, made small talk at bars, occasionally brought men home. No one thought to ask what happened after that, because Jeffrey Dahmer was quiet, polite, invisible almost, and no one, not his neighbors, not his teachers, not even his parents, could see what was already beginning to take shape behind his eyes. Something methodical, something cold, something that would one day fill his freezer with pieces of people, and his mind with a silence even he could no longer escape. It happened in 1978. Jeffrey Dahmer was 18 years old, living in his childhood home in Bath, Ohio. His parents were gone. His mother had taken his younger brother and moved out after the divorce. His father had relocated temporarily, unaware that Jeffrey had been left behind in the house. The silence suited him. No one asked questions. No one watched. The man who walked into that house with Jeffrey Dahmer on a warm June evening was named Stephen Hicks, 19 years old, hitchhiking to a concert. Friendly, trusting, not in a rush. They talked casually by the side of the road, and Dahmer, charming in his own quiet way, offered him a ride, maybe a beer, maybe just a place to hang out before heading back out. Stephen accepted. He never left. What happened inside the house that night was, for Jeffrey, both terrifying and euphoric. They talked, listened to music, drank. Stephen said he needed to go. Dahmer didn't want him to. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply didn't want the evening to end. So when Stephen stood to leave, Dahmer picked up a dumbbell and struck him from behind. Then, as Stephen lay on the floor, Dahmer strangled him. There was no screaming, no chase, just a quiet act of violence in an otherwise still house. Afterward, he sat with the body, not panicked, not rushing to hide what he had done, just sitting, processing. He would later say that the most compelling thing about having someone dead in front of him was the stillness, the control. There was no rejection, no conversation, just presence. He kept the body for a day, then 2. Eventually, he dissected it in the basement, removed the flesh, crushed the bones with a sledgehammer, placed what remained into garbage bags, and scattered them in the woods behind the house. He kept certain parts longer than others, experimented, not with science, but with sensation. When Lionel Dahmer returned a few weeks later, nothing in the house suggested what had happened. No blood, no smell, no sign of Stephen Hicks. And Jeffrey, thin, pale, quietly distracted, offered no clues. It would be nearly a decade before he killed again. In that time, he drifted. Jobs came and went. He enrolled in college briefly, dropped out, joined the Army, then returned home. Lived with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin. Tried to control his urges. Read the Bible. Attended church. Went on walks late at night when the tension became too much. He tried to live normally, tried to be invisible, but the fantasies were always there, not just about sex or violence, but about stillness, about having someone who couldn't leave, couldn't look away, couldn't say no. In 1987, it happened again. He met Stephen Twomey at a bar in Milwaukee. Another kind stranger. Another drink, another offer to go somewhere quieter. They checked into a hotel. Dahmer later claimed he didn't remember killing Twomey, that he woke up and found him dead, blood pooling from his mouth, that something inside him had taken over. Whether that's true or not, the result was the same. He stuffed the body into a suitcase and carried it through the city. Brought it back to his grandmother's house, dismembered it in the basement, kept parts of it, flushed others down the toilet. No one suspected a thing. The next morning, he ate breakfast with his grandmother and helped her bring in the groceries. She never asked what was in the suitcase, and he never told. In 1990, Jeffrey Dahmer moved into the Oxford Apartments at 924 North 25th Street in Milwaukee. He was 30 years old. His new home, apartment 213, was on the second floor of a three-story building, not far from downtown. A small space, one bedroom, one bath, a modest kitchen. Nothing stood out. Nothing seemed unusual. Just another quiet man with a lease and a routine. To the outside world, Dahmer appeared ordinary. He worked at the Ambrosia chocolate factory, the night shift. He wore glasses, kept to himself, occasionally exchanged polite greetings with neighbors. He paid rent on time, no loud music, no parties, just a soft-spoken tenant in a nondescript building. But inside apartment 213, something horrifying was taking shape. This was the space where the killings became consistent. The rituals became refined, and the line between murder and routine vanished. By the time he moved in, Dahmer had already killed several men, some in hotels, others in his grandmother's basement. But now, with privacy and control, his process evolved. He began luring men back to his apartment with offers of money, drinks, or photography. Many were young, most were vulnerable, runaways, immigrants, boys estranged from their families, some as young as 14. Once inside, Dahmer would offer a drink, often spiked with sleeping pills or tranquilizers. He would wait, and when they passed out, he'd act quickly, strangulation, sometimes with his hands, sometimes with a leather strap, quiet, efficient, mechanical, but the killing was only the beginning. He posed the bodies, photographed them, sometimes for hours. He spoke to them, touched them, laid beside them. He bathed the corpses, dismembered them in his bathtub, cleaned the bones, preserved certain parts, hands, skulls, internal organs, the refrigerator, the freezer, the filing cabinet. Even a box in the closet each held pieces of human remains, some carefully wrapped, others floating in jars of formaldehyde. He experimented with preservation techniques, boiled skulls, bleached bones, attempted crude mummification, tried to make an altar, an arrangement of candles and bones, planned meticulously, almost reverently. He wanted a place to sit, to reflect, to feel surrounded by what he called his people, not trophies, not evidence, companions. He didn't kill in anger, didn't scream or taunt. He wasn't seeking revenge. He just wanted them to stay, to be still, to not leave him. And when the bodies started to decompose too quickly for his liking, he began drilling into the skulls of his victims, injecting acid or boiling water into their brains, trying to create something between life and death, a living zombie, someone who would breathe, walk, exist, but never leave. It didn't work. The men always died, sometimes after hours, sometimes after days. And when they did, the cycle repeated. Neighbors complained of smells, strange chemical odors that seemed to seep through the walls and hallways. But the landlord did little. Dahmer explained it away, said he had spoiled meat or tropical fish that had died in their tank. He even let maintenance workers inside once, casually moving garbage bags out of sight while they repaired a leak. No one looked closely. No one imagined the truth. He kept a Polaroid camera near his bed. Dozens of images, carefully arranged. Bodies in various states of dissection, posed with care arms extended, heads tilted, sometimes propped up as if asleep. And yet, by morning, Dahmer would shower, put on his work uniform, and head back to the chocolate factory. He was on time. He kept to himself. He passed co-workers in the hallway and nodded politely. They had no idea what he had done just hours before. He was no longer trying to stop. He was building a world where he wouldn't have to. It was just past midnight on May 27, 1991, when Jeffrey Dahmer brought home another victim. The boy's name was Connor Xanthasophone. He was 14 years old, soft-faced, quiet, and far too young to be wandering alone through Milwaukee's late-night streets. Dahmer had approached him earlier that evening with a now familiar proposition, a few dollars in exchange for some photographs. Connor was reluctant but eventually agreed. He followed Dahmer back to apartment 213, not realizing that the door he was walking through had already closed behind so many others. Inside, Dahmer offered him a drink laced with sleeping pills. Once the boy began to lose consciousness, he laid him down and, with a methodical steadiness, drilled a small hole into his skull. Then he injected hydrochloric acid directly into the frontal lobe of the brain. This wasn't a moment of rage or improvisation, it was a calculated experiment. Dahmer wanted to create a living, breathing zombie, a person who was present in body but stripped of will, a companion who would never leave him, never speak back, never reject him. Connor was still alive when Dahmer left the apartment to buy beer. And that was when something unimaginable happened. In a haze of confusion and trauma, Connor managed to escape. Naked, disoriented, and bleeding, he stumbled out into the early morning streets. A group of 3 black women found him outside the building, alarmed by the sight of a child in clear distress. They wrapped him in a towel, tried to speak to him, and called 911. When police officers Joseph Gabrish and John Bolcherzak arrived on scene, the women explained what they had witnessed: a naked child unable to speak clearly, clearly terrified, and clearly in need of help. But then Jeffrey Dahmer appeared, calm, soft-spoken, sober. He told the officers it was a misunderstanding, that Connor was his 19-year-old boyfriend who had simply had too much to drink. He apologized for the disruption and said they often had fights like this. The boy, unable to speak due to the brain injury, couldn't contradict him. The officers didn't ask for identification. They didn't question the story. They ignored the protests of the women, who were insisting that something was deeply wrong. Instead, the officers walked Connor and Dahmer back to apartment 213. They stepped inside briefly, looked around, and then left. They didn't notice the smell. They didn't check the refrigerator. They didn't see the photos lying nearby, the ones Dahmer had just taken of Connor before drilling into his skull. Within the hour, the boy was dead. Dahmer strangled him and dismembered the body the next day. He kept the skull as a memento, one of many lining the inside of drawers, boxes, and cabinets throughout the apartment. The police had been just inches from stopping it all. One question, one glance, 1 ounce of suspicion could have brought everything crashing down. Instead, they made jokes on the squad car radio about the situation, mocked the neighbors, laughed about gay domestic disputes, and went back to their routine. They never followed up. The case was closed in their eyes. Conrad's death wasn't just another name on Dahmer's list. It was the ultimate proof to him that he could do anything, that no one would stop him, that the world outside his apartment door was blind, indifferent, or both. And in the months that followed, his killings escalated. He no longer feared exposure. He had looked the law in the eye and watched it walk away. By the summer of 1991, apartment 213 had become something less like a home and more like a mausoleum. The killing had become routine. Dahmer had perfected his pattern: the bars, the photos, the drinks, the silence. Victims came and went, sometimes within days of each other. The apartment was a pressure chamber of death, filled with jars of flesh, piles of bones, and a freezer packed with body parts. But to Jeffrey Dahmer, this was more than just disposal. It was ritual. He wasn't simply killing to satisfy an urge, he was building something. Piece by piece. He began calling it an altar. In his imagination, it was a sacred space. A black table against the wall, covered with candles. Skulls arranged carefully at each end, illuminated by soft light. Behind them, the painted backdrop of a black curtain. In front, a chair, his chair where he would sit and reflect, surrounded by the physical remains of the only people who had ever made him feel less alone. He sketched the plans for it on yellow-lined paper. Every detail was calculated: the placement of the candles, the arrangement of the bones, the symmetry of the bodies long since vanished. The purpose of the altar wasn't worship. It was connection. He wanted to feel surrounded by those he had loved, or, at least, those he had consumed. The idea wasn't born out of hatred or fury. It came from a place of unbearable isolation. He once said he didn't kill to cause pain. He killed because he couldn't bear the thought of someone leaving. The altar was his way of making them stay forever. Neighbors, meanwhile, were no longer silent. The smell had become overwhelming, sour, chemical, rotting. It seeped into the hallway, into the floorboards, into memory. Residents began calling the building manager again and again, complaining about a rancid odor that seemed to radiate from Dahmer's apartment. One woman said it made her gag every time she passed his door. Another said it was worse in the heat. Some thought he was storing animal carcasses. Others suspected drugs. A few just kept their distance. When asked directly about the smell, Dahmer would always offer the same line: "The freezer broke, some meat spoiled. It's taken care of now." He said it with such disarming calmness that the issue was always dropped. He even invited the building manager inside once to prove it. He guided her to the kitchen, offered a quiet apology, opened the fridge having already tucked the body parts away. She saw nothing, smelled everything, left quickly. But the truth was beginning to break through the cracks. Even Dahmer could sense that he was reaching the end. He began drinking more heavily. His murders became sloppier, less cautious. He brought home men he barely spoke to. Sometimes two in the same weekend. The apartment filled with blood-stained mattresses, photos, bone fragments, and tools. He had reached the peak of his obsession. The altar was almost ready. Then came his final victim. Or rather, the man who survived. Tracy Edwards. A man who walked into apartment 213 expecting a quiet evening and walked out with the police behind him. But that moment, that final break in the ritual, would only come after one last night of horror. On July 22, 1991, Tracy Edwards met Jeffrey Dahmer at a shopping mall in Milwaukee. It was early evening, humid, with the sky already beginning to darken in that midsummer way where day slips into night without much warning. Dahmer struck up a conversation, casual, friendly, with just enough charm to lower guard. He told Edwards he was a photographer, invited him over to see some pictures and have a few drinks. Edwards, 22 years old, wasn't suspicious, just curious, looking for a way to pass the time. He agreed. What he stepped into was not an apartment. It was a trap. The moment the door to apartment 213 shut behind them, something felt off. There was a smell, sharp, chemical, but also deeply rotten, something wrong in the air. The windows were sealed. The place was unusually hot. Inside, the television played The Exorcist 3 on a loop. A blue barrel stood in the corner, boxes stacked along the wall, and the feeling that whatever this was, it wasn't going to be a simple night. Dahmer handed him a drink. Tracy took a sip but quickly grew uneasy. He asked questions. Dahmer responded with vague, slow answers. Then he snapped a handcuff onto Tracy's wrist. Just one cuff. The other dangled loose. Tracy laughed nervously, tried to play along, but fear had already taken root in his chest. Then Dahmer pulled out a knife. He told Tracy to do as he was told. To lie still. To let him take photos. To stay quiet. But Dahmer was drunk, his coordination off. He paced back and forth, muttering under his breath, occasionally glancing at the TV. The movie flickered in the dark room, loud, violent, surreal. Tracy noticed a camera near the bed, a stack of Polaroids on the floor, something in the corner that looked like blood dried into the carpet. He knew he had to stay calm. So he talked. He kept Dahmer engaged. Asked him questions. Tried to sound interested, even friendly. He looked for a moment, any moment, to escape. After nearly an hour of circling conversation, Tracy asked to use the bathroom. When Dahmer hesitated, Tracy stood and moved toward the door. And then he ran. He bolted into the hallway, handcuffed, shirtless, shouting for help to police officers patrolling nearby. Spotted him and stopped the car. Tracy was breathless, frantic, but coherent. He told them a man had tried to kill him. Said there were strange photos, a knife. Something wrong. The officers listened, and then, unlike the men who had dismissed Connericks into some phone just weeks earlier, they followed him back to the apartment. What they found inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The smell was immediate, heavy, decaying. One officer stayed with Dahmer in the living room while the other searched the bedroom. On the dresser, in plain view, was a stack of Polaroids, dozens of them, photos of dismembered bodies, some mid-process, some posed. One officer turned to the other and quietly said, "These are for real." Dahmer didn't fight. He didn't run. He simply stood still and muttered, "For what I did, I should be dead." The apartment was sealed off. Forensics moved in, and behind the closed doors of room 213, investigators uncovered what could only be described as a human horror museum. Skulls in the closet, hands in the freezer, a human heart wrapped in plastic, 3 torsos dissolving in the blue barrel filled with acid, over 70 Polaroids, blood spatters on the walls, and in the freezer an entire head. Outside, the press gathered quickly. News vans, reporters, neighbors in disbelief. The soft-spoken man with the glasses, who helped carry groceries and nodded politely, had been living among corpses for years. It was over. But the full scope of what Jeffrey Dahmer had done was only beginning to come into focus. Jeffrey Dahmer didn't resist arrest. When the officers uncovered the photos and saw the look in his eyes, flat, almost relieved, they put him in handcuffs and walked him down the stairs without incident. In the back of the squad car, Dahmer reportedly sat in silence, occasionally murmuring under his breath. There was no shouting, no begging, just the quiet presence of a man who seemed to know it was over. At the station, he waived his right to an attorney and began to talk. What followed was one of the most disturbing and methodical confessions in criminal history. For hours, then days, Dahmer described everything. Every victim, every act, names, places, dates. He didn't stumble or hesitate. There was no bravado, no theatrics. He spoke plainly, almost politely, as if he were simply sharing information that someone needed to know. He told detectives that he had murdered 17 young men between 1978 and 1991. Some of the names were known, reported missing by loved ones years earlier. Others were never even listed as missing at all. He explained his process in meticulous detail. The drugs he used, the way he positioned the bodies, how he chose who would live and who would die. He talked about the blue barrel, the acid, the freezer, the heart in the fridge. He spoke about the failed zombie experiments, drilling holes into skulls and injecting boiling water or acid in hopes of creating passive companions. He described posing the bodies for photographs, sleeping beside corpses for days, and how the smell never truly went away, no matter how much he cleaned. But perhaps most chilling of all was his tone. There was no outward malice in his voice, no anger. Just flat acceptance. He knew what he had done. And he knew there was no explanation that would make it understandable. When asked why, he said it wasn't about hate. It wasn't about control, even. It was about loneliness. An unbearable fear of abandonment. He wanted people who would never leave. Who would never say no. He said he loved some of them. Not in the way most people understand love, but in the only way he could. He called the killings a compulsion, something he tried to stop, even feared, but could never resist. In the days after the arrest, detectives cataloged the evidence. It was overwhelming. Inside apartment 213, they found 4 severed heads, 7 skulls, 2 hearts, 2 entire skeletons, and countless fragments of bone and tissue. There were over 70 Polaroid photographs of victims, each one carefully posed and labeled. The blue barrel contained 3 torsos in various stages of decomposition. Drawings of his planned altar were found beneath his mattress, showing the arrangement of bones, candles, and skulls. One of the detectives would later say that the apartment didn't look like a crime scene, it looked like a morgue someone had tried to decorate. As the investigation unfolded, the city of Milwaukee was stunned. The media swarmed the neighborhood. People gathered outside the Oxford apartments, staring in disbelief at the windows of apartment 213. Victims' families began receiving phone calls from the police, confirming the worst. And yet, in the midst of the chaos, Dahmer remained calm. Almost unnervingly so. He requested no legal defense. He didn't try to plead insanity. He said he wanted it to end. I created this horror, and it only makes sense I do everything to put an end to it, he told police. There was no moment of madness to point to. No psychotic break. Just a long, slow descent into obsession, carried out in silence behind a locked apartment door, as neighbors walked past and the world looked the other way. The trial of Jeffrey Dahmer began in January of 1992, just 6 months after his arrest. It took place at the Milwaukee County Courthouse, a gray, boxy building that soon became the epicenter of a national spectacle. By the time proceedings began, Dahmer was no longer just a local case, he was an international headline. The words Milwaukee Cannibal were plastered across newspapers in every country. Television networks aired nightly specials. True crime magazines sold out. The public wanted every detail. And yet, the man at the center of it all, quiet, pale, and dressed in a simple shirt and tie, seemed almost ghost-like as he entered the courtroom. He faced 15 counts of murder. Each count corresponded to a name, some known, some only recently identified through dental records and fragments of bone. In the weeks leading up to the trial, his defense team had struggled with strategy. There was no question of guilt. Dahmer had confessed in full, had led police to evidence, had never once denied what he did. The only possible defense was insanity. If they could convince the court that he was mentally ill at the time of the crimes, he might avoid prison and be committed to a psychiatric institution instead. It was a difficult argument to make, because, as horrifying as the crimes were, everything Dahmer had done suggested calculation. He picked his victims carefully, avoided detection for over a decade, hid evidence, cleaned the scenes, maintained a job, paid his rent, and when he spoke about the killings, he did so with clarity and unnerving self-awareness. The prosecution argued that he was not insane, he was evil, that he knew what he was doing, knew it was wrong, and chose to do it anyway, that he didn't kill out of madness, but out of desire. Over the course of 3 weeks, the court heard testimony from detectives, medical examiners, forensic experts, and psychologists. They saw photos, hundreds of them. Images of dismembered bodies, decapitated heads, freezers filled with organs. They listened to the tapes of Dahmer's interviews, saw the drawings of the altar, and throughout it all, the man himself sat quietly at the defense table, rarely speaking, never crying, his hands folded neatly in front of him. But the most powerful moments came when the families of his victims took the stand. One by one, mothers, fathers, siblings, and partners stood in front of the courtroom and spoke of the holes left in their lives. They described birthdays never celebrated, voices never heard again, dreams forever interrupted. Some wept. Others shouted. One woman's sister of victim Errol Lindsay screamed at Dahmer, trembling with rage, demanding to know why. Why her brother? Why anyone? The courtroom fell into silence after her outburst. Dahmer didn't respond. He simply looked down at the table. The jury deliberated for a short time, barely more than a day. On February 17, 1992, they returned with a verdict, guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, totaling 957 years in prison. The judge, in delivering the sentence, described his acts as incomprehensible and unfathomable. He said no punishment would ever undo the damage. No amount of time behind bars could restore what had been lost. Dahmer spoke briefly before sentencing. His voice was quiet but steady. I know society will never be able to forgive me. I know I will never be able to forgive myself. I should have stayed with God. I tried and I failed. I created a world of death, and now I have to live in it. He was led from the courtroom in handcuffs. Behind him, the families remained seated, some in tears, some in silence, all forever changed. The trial was over, but the shadow it cast would linger far beyond that courtroom. Jeffrey Dahmer was sent to the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. At first, he was placed in solitary confinement not for punishment, but for protection. The prison officials knew what he had done, and more importantly, they knew that the other inmates knew as well. His name carried weight, even among murderers. For the first year, he spent his days in a small cell alone, reading the Bible, watching TV, writing letters. The man who had once lived surrounded by corpses was now surrounded by walls, steel, and the cold stillness of institutional routine. Eventually, he requested to be moved to the general population. He said he was ready to face whatever came. And surprisingly, the prison agreed. Among other inmates, Dahmer became an odd figure. Some saw him as infamous, others as pathetic. He kept to himself but occasionally joked darkly about his crimes, making comments that unsettled even the most hardened prisoners. He drew attention, whether he wanted it or not. And despite the tight controls, the sense of inevitability was there. Everyone knew that someone, someday, might try to end his life. That moment came on the morning of November 28, 1994. Dahmer had been assigned to a janitorial work detail alongside two other inmates, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver. The three men were left alone in a bathroom for 20 minutes. When guards returned, Dahmer was lying on the floor, his skull crushed with a metal bar. Anderson was also fatally beaten. Scarver later claimed he had acted alone, guided by what he called divine justice. He said Dahmer had mocked people in prison, that he had shaped food into limbs and pretended to eat them, that someone had to stop him. Dahmer was pronounced dead an hour later. There was no funeral, no marked grave. At his request, his body was cremated, and his ashes were split between his parents. The Oxford apartments, where he had killed most of his victims, were torn down in 1992. The lot remains empty, a patch of grass where people rarely stop. Occasionally, flowers are left at the edge. Not for Dahmer, but for those who never came home. Years later, The story of Jeffrey Dahmer continues to fascinate and repulse. Documentaries, books, interviews, a museum exhibit even. People ask why. Try to understand. But in truth, there's little understanding to be found. His crimes were not just brutal. They were quiet. They hid behind politeness, under a smile, inside an apartment with the windows always shut. What makes the story so chilling is not only what he did, but how long no one noticed. 17 men. 17 families. And a man who said he killed because he didn't want to be alone. Perhaps the most terrifying thing about Jeffrey Dahmer is how ordinary he looked. He could have been your neighbor. He often was.